As we continue on in James, today's reading is from James chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, and can be found on page 1725 of the Pew Bibles. 1725. James chapter 5, verses 1 to 6. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Here ends the reading. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Lynn. Well, could I begin by asking what time is it? Someone have the time? Genuine question. Someone tell me what time it is. Yep, 10 to 9. Good. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I was a bit nervous about the clock on the back wall because if I refer to that and it's wrong, or if it's stopped, can you imagine what might happen? Yep, we could be here for hours as I ramble on and on and on, oblivious to the actual time. But it makes me wonder what might happen. Like, would you leave? Would Tom stand up and tap his watch? Like, what would happen? Would Graham ring the bell or Brad ring the bell? I'd love to know. Don't worry, I'm not going to test any of those theories out today. But I wonder if you've had the experience of not getting the timing right. Maybe you've missed an appointment. You're expecting to be there at a certain time and you showed up, but you were early or they were late or they didn't even know you were coming. Something went wrong with the timing. Or maybe you've been one of the many people recently who've missed a bus or a train or a plane because the timing wasn't what you were expecting or because something got cancelled. Or maybe you've found yourself out of time musically, which is very embarrassing. Maybe you've found yourself clapping too soon or out of sync, or you've sung the next verse when everyone else knew to wait. It's really awkward. It's really bad. But at the start of James 5, James is speaking to people who haven't got the timing right. People who have failed to live out the wisdom about the future that God's made known to believers. God has been so kind to us, giving us believers like us his wisdom about the future. And his grace to believers like us helps us to be clear about the time we live in. But James says this in verse 1, chapter 5, verse 1. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Now, we might have our own picture of a rich person, but in James's time, the rich were the landowners, the people who possessed property, who employed workers. They were the rich. And when James is talking to the rich, landowners, employers, they're who he's talking to. And we might think to ourselves, well, that's not me. James is talking about other people. I can get out the popcorn and listen in as he tears strips off the rich. But here's the thing, many of us might have more in common with the rich here than we think. Because in James's letter, some of the rich are believers, while others who are also called rich mistreat believers. We've got a bit of a mixed bag even within James about who the rich are. And so for James, it's not a clear-cut category. As well as this, in James's time, the rich weren't living day-to-day, paycheck to paycheck, hand-to-mouth, like the plebs and peasants. No, the rich had clothes in the wardrobe that they weren't wearing. They had food in the fridge. They had money in the bank. And so if that's the reality for the rich then, if they could be believers with bank accounts, then what James has to say matters to us. We're in this. And so what does James say? Well, his command is for the rich to weep and wail because of the misery coming on them. Well, this command from James is written to his first century Jewish audience. It could easily have been taken from earlier, from the time of the prophets in the Old Testament, calling on people to weep and wail. That's exactly the way that the prophets spoke about God's enemies, calling on God's enemies to weep and wail because judgment was coming. That was the only response available to God's enemies, weeping and wailing. And so when James adopts this prophetic call, it's meant to remind us of what's at stake for those who get the timing wrong. If God's wisdom about the future continues to have no impact on them, on us, then misery's coming. Throughout the letter, James has been sharing with us God's wisdom about different aspects of the Christian life. And last week, at the end of chapter 4, we heard God's wisdom about the future, that we don't even know what will happen tomorrow, that our life is a mist. But here in chapter 5, James shows us what we do know about the future. Look with me at verse 2 and 3, chapter 5. He says, "Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded." This is a picture of the future of our wealth, and the destination of our possessions. It's the destruction of everything we own. That's what awaits. It's as if a dump truck has pulled up out the front of your house and everything has gone in. Nothing has been left behind, not even the kitchen sink. That's the future that James paints for us here. Everything you've ever bought or been given or owned goes in the dump truck. Every item you've collected, every project you've constructed, everything you thought you'd use one day, it's all going in. Every cent you've squirreled away in super or savings is there with all your stuff in the dump truck. And whether the dump truck shows up at the end of your life or at Jesus' return doesn't matter, because the destination of your wealth, all your things, is the same. Your wealth and possessions and money, whatever they are, however much, however little, will be landfill. Now, this is a hard picture to see, isn't it? It's heartbreaking to consider that kind of loss. We grieve when we see this sort of thing happen during bushfires, during natural disasters, when people suffer great loss. But our response to the loss of our wealth that James talks about tells us something about our heart. Jesus reminds us of this in Matthew chapter 6 when he says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This picture of the future tells us something about our heart. I wonder, what earthly treasure can't you imagine being without? Is there something you have that you can't bear to lose? Something you could never give up? God's wisdom reminds us that one day you will lose all of them, everything. No matter how special or significant, how secure or satisfying, we will all be separated from all of it, from all the wealth, all the money, all the possessions we have in this life. And as difficult as all this might be for us to grasp, God shares this wisdom with us for our good, so that we might adopt his perspective on our wealth now, before that day comes. It might be painful. We might weep and wail as God loosens our grip on the things we have. But we need to go through this. We need to ask God, invite God to loosen our grip on our things out of wholehearted devotion to him, trusting in him as we willingly live out his wisdom about our wealth. By taking it to heart now, will avoid the weeping and wailing, the misery of the day to come. As James shares God's wisdom about the future of wealth with us, it's not just meant to make us weep and wail. For believers, God's wisdom is meant to make a difference to us. That's the message of James. And James sharpens this point for us later on in verse 3. So verse 3, your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. That's a horrifying image, isn't it? James says that all the stuff being carried off to landfill testifies against us. It's like in a courtroom, the wealth that will be taken away from us will be used in evidence against us. Why? Why is it evidence against us? Well, because it proves or disproves what James says next at the end of verse 3. It proves or disproves whether we've hoarded wealth in the last days. Tells us whether we've got the timing right or not. Now, this statement at the end of verse 3 is a really important statement for us. It's important because here James reminds us what time it is. The timing God has made clear to us is that we are in the last days. God's Son, his chosen King Jesus, has come into the world. That's happened. Jesus has died and has risen from the dead. That's happened. And right now we're waiting for his promised return. That's the time. We're waiting for the day when Jesus will come again to save those who are his and to judge the living and the dead. The period between Jesus' resurrection and return is a time that James and other New Testament writers call the last days. And we're living in them, just as James and his audience were. Now, if we know God's wisdom about these things, about this future, then that's meant to change us. Hoarding wealth is the kind of thing we would expect to do if we knew nothing about God's future. The extreme example of hoarding wealth in the last days comes in James' observation about the rich in verse 5, a couple of verses on. This is what James says. He says, you have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. This is an issue of timing, of failing to live out God's wisdom about the future. We're in the last days. But these people are living in luxury and self-indulgence. They've got it wrong. They're wastefully spending their wealth on their own pleasures when the last days have begun. At a time when Jesus could have come and hold them accountable at any moment. But instead of trying to avoid that judgment, prepare for that judgment, prepare for Jesus' return, they're bringing greater guilt on themselves. Just pretend for a moment that insider trading doesn't exist. And imagine that I received a tip from a reliable source about a company that was about to go under. Receivers are circling, media outlets are just about to be notified. But then knowing that information about the company about to go under, I choose to increase my investment in them. Not just a little bit in case the prediction's wrong, but going all in. I cash in all my other investments. I pull out all my superannuation. I load up at the payday lenders. I sell everything I possibly can. And then I use it all to buy shares in the company that's on the brink of falling over. What would you think of me if I did that? You'd think I was crazy, right? But it's no less crazy than if we hoard wealth in the last days. Hoarding here means keeping things that we don't need, keeping things beyond what we need, gathering, storing, saving possessions and money. Now, I know that there are genuine diagnosed hoarders, and I don't want to load people in that situation up with guilt. But there are also some of us, me included, who find it really easy to add to what we already have without giving it a second thought, to keep more than we need, to buy what we won't use, to collect for the sake of collecting. Now, I don't consider myself a hoarder, but still, my library is filled with books I haven't read. and many I probably never will read. Even if I started today, I don't think I'd get through them, but I still spend money on more. It's crazy. Maybe you have something else like that, an area of your life that gets added to like that. What James shares with us is that we will be held accountable for our wealth, for each possession we kept, for every dollar we held onto. For all our wealth will be asked by Jesus, our Saviour and our Lord, how did you use that in the last days? How did you use that wealth that I gave you in the last days? Knowing that we're in the last days before Jesus returns is meant to change us. But it's also possible for us to forget the time that we're in. This might be something that the rich are particularly susceptible to, but I don't think it's limited to the rich. Any of us could slip into sinful habits with our wealth, especially if we forget what time we're in. Jesus gives us an example of this in Luke chapter 12. In the parable, he encourages his disciples to be prepared for his return, to be prepared like a servant waiting for their master to come back from a wedding feast. And like good servants, Jesus encourages them to faithfully do what their master has asked them to do, so that that's what they'll be found doing when he returns, whenever that is, middle of the night, early morning, whenever it is, they'll be ready. And they'll be rewarded for their faithfulness when he does return. That's the picture of the ideal servant, of what we're meant to be as we wait. What does Jesus want us to do with our wealth? That's our question. But then Jesus goes on to describe an alternative. Let me read it to you. But suppose the servant says to himself, my master is taking a long time in coming. And he then begins to beat the other servants, both men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. The servant who knows the master's will and does not get ready, or does not do what the master wants, will be beaten with many blows. But the one who does not know and does things deserving punishment will be beaten with few blows. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. As people who God has made the future known to, we have a huge responsibility to listen and to act and to change in response to that. And what Jesus says in Luke 12 shows us the risk that we're at of not doing that. This isn't just a rebuke for other people. This isn't just a rebuke for people who are richer than us. This is a serious warning for all of us as we knowingly anticipate Jesus' return. So far, James has shown us the impact of getting the timing wrong, and we've recognised our need to respond to God's wisdom about the future rather than hoarding wealth in the last days. And in verses 4 and 6, our focus shifts from the future to the present. James shows us up close what hoarding wealth looks like as he continues his rebuke of the rich. This is what James says in verse 4. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. Now you can tell by how James begins that this situation was scandalous then, and it would be scandalous even now. It's because of bosses like this that the Fair Work Commission exists. The rich landowners that James has in view are hiring workers, mowers, harvesters for their fields. And they would be hired at the agreed rate before they started. And then at the end of the day, the landowner would get his foreman to go and pay them the agreed wage. That's how it's meant to work. But James tells us that the landowners don't pay. And because they wanted to hoard wealth, they hold out. Maybe they said they'd give it later. But in the end, they keep the wages, using it for themselves. Now, how painful would it be to be on the receiving end of this kind of treatment from someone you work for? Maybe you already know the answer. Maybe you've experienced that. It'd be horrible. And we get a picture of why this is such a problem for workers like these in Deuteronomy 24. This is what God says. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry to the Lord against you, and you'll be guilty of sin. In this case, the rich haven't just failed to love their neighbour, as serious as that is. They haven't just failed to care for the poor and needy. No, they've also done exactly what God forbids, defying God's wisdom and completely ignoring any future accountability from Him. That is not how to use wealth in the last days. And one of the things this rebuke reminds us is that hoarding wealth isn't victimless. It actually harms others. It might not always be as obvious as in this case, but if we're holding tightly to what we have, if we're using our wealth for our benefit alone, then someone else is missing out. This could mean I'll be slow to pay bills and debts because I don't notice or care how that might affect the well-being of others. Or it could mean that I'll use all my resources for my own enjoyment, which will close off any opportunities to meet the needs of others, to share my God-given wealth with them. That's what it could mean if I'm holding tightly to these things, if I'm hoarding wealth in the last days. If I'm not living out God's wisdom about the future, I'll continue looking for what I can get, what I can keep, what I can add to what I have. And I'll have the blinders on for others with no expectation for accountability. That's what this looks like when we get this wrong. But then, when accountability does come, and it will, I'll be no better off than the rich in verse 1, weeping, wailing, in misery. James's final and most serious charge comes in verse 6. James says to the rich in verse 6, "You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." Again, this is an activity of the rich. As bad as landowners ripping off workers for selfish reasons might be, murdering is certainly worse. This is the third time in the letter that James has spoken of murder. And like those previous times, it's unlikely that James is talking about those who physically get their hands dirty and stick the knife in. It's likely instead that the rich have been manipulating the judicial process to get what they want, no matter who might be harmed in the process. If you're hoarding wealth, that's what happens. By using such serious language, it looks like James wants the rich to feel the weight of this course of action, the misery that will await them for not living out God's wisdom for the future, the misery that will await them for ignoring the coming judgment, because it will come. The idea of the innocent one here, I think, also reminds us of Jesus. As a result of a judicial process, Jesus, the innocent one, was condemned to death, and he died at the hands of those he wasn't opposing, which confirms for us at the end of this passage that the rich, by their behaviour, are setting themselves up against him. And if we hoard wealth in the last days, I think we're at risk of the same thing. And Jesus' return will not be a day of rejoicing for people who behave like that. Instead, as we heard in verse 1, it will be a day of weeping and wailing, a day of misery as God's promised future becomes the present for all, whether they're expecting it or not. As we finish up, can I ask again, what time is it? What time is it? Yep. It's good to know the time. It's even better to live it out, right? In this passage, we've heard God's wisdom about the future. We've been reminded that we live in the last days. And in God's kindness to us in the last days, he has shown us the final destination of wealth so that we'll loosen our grip on what we have. He's helped us to wait for the full and final revelation of Jesus as King. That's what we're looking forward to. And God has encouraged us to look forward to the judgment that is coming on all people based on their response to him during their life on earth. And this is the future that's meant to shape and change every aspect of our lives, including how we use our wealth. And this is the future that's meant to draw us to be wholehearted in our devotion to God as we anticipate meeting him being in the throne, before the throne of his Son. This is the future that's meant to drive our single-minded confidence in Christ. It's meant to lead us to be committed to living out God's wisdom in the world until that day, until the day of Christ's return.